The reason why the United States was on the other side of the world in the Western Pacific, knocking on the door of Japan, wanting to Japanese to drop the Tokugawa shogunate to drop their ultra-isolationist policy, has to do fundamentally with geography at the time. Now, have a look at the situation here. As you can see, this imagine it's 1850. Better yet, make it 1849. And you can see over here when we're looking at North America, here are the states that were formally states at this time, 1849, and it's mostly the eastern portion of the country. Much of the West were territories. To become a state, out of a territory, you had to have a certain amount of population, a certain amount of political infrastructure, a certain amount of economic development. And so these areas were territories, not states. But what happened in 1849 was that gold was discovered in California. And the result, of course, would be that California would be made a state in 1850, in effect, well before the intervening territories, everything extending from, as you can see here, Nebraska, Wyoming, across to Nevada. You get the point. All California is, in effect, an island of sorts, way out here as a state, separated from the rest of the states. And therefore, you can understand the difficulties you would have in the eastern portion of the states as you want to get out to California and take advantage of the economic opportunity of the gold rush in 1849. And you can see the difficulties here. You'd have to be put to ship, and you'd try to sail all the way around South America, go through the Straits of Magellan, extremely dangerous here, then sail all the way up here to get to California. That is long, costly, and dangerous. It's not going to help you develop California in a timely fashion. Then there was an attempt to go through Central America. If I had time, I would talk about the significance of that for Nicaragua, but I don't. That turned out to be problematic, to say the least, as well. What you want to do, ultimately, is get a railroad built out over here, but you wouldn't get the Trans-American Railroad constructed until, what, 1869, if I recall, was the date for the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. And so you still got, some 15, 16, 17 years or so before that railroad is built, and allowing easy access from the eastern portion of the United States towards the west. Now, hold up a minute. Well, this computer program is acting up on me. Suffice to say, let's not worry about the details there about the Transcontinental Railroad. For some reason, my memory's off. I can't remember the date. I'm pretty sure it was 1869. In any case, let's not worry about that. All right? So imagine it's 1849. You want to get out to the gold rush in the eastern states, and you're thinking, hey, look, we need to get a lot of cheap labor out there, especially cheap labor to build that Transcontinental Railroad. And a fantastic place to get labor would be China. China is, in effect, closer to California than the eastern portion of the United States because the friction of distance going over land is far greater than it is going by sea. And thus, you want to get to China to get the Chinese labor, which is disposed towards emigration, has a reputation as being a pliable labor source, can deal with difficult conditions. That's another way of saying being exploited without a problem. Other labor groups are problematic if you want to abuse in this fashion. The Chinese were far more tolerable of conditions other groups would find a little difficult to cope with in any case. And of course, if you want to get out to California, to China to get cheap labor to bring into California, you can see, computer's acting up here, let's see, there we go. You want to get out to California, you can see that Japan is in the way. And you might think, well, that's a bit simplistic. Why don't you just go around Japan and get to China? Remember what the principal form of locomotion was during this period, middle of the 19th century. All right. The middle of the 19th century, you see the steam engine is the premier form of long-distance locomotion over the sea. And what that means is you're going to have to establish coaling stations periodically to service long-distance naval transport. In fact, you can look at the British Empire here in all the way in the beginning of the 20th century, and the British Empire was this massive empire, all these red areas, which was serviced by long distance maritime trade. And there you can see all these little blue dots. As you can see what it says down here, those are coaling stations. So if you want to establish long distance trade overseas and you're using the steam engine, you need to establish coaling stations. And therefore you understand why the United States wanted to get into Japan. It isn't so much getting into Japan to get at resources. The United States was the Commodore Perry was carrying a letter from President Fillmore asking the Japanese to open up strictly for the desire of establishing a coaling station so that the United States could access East Asian labor supplies. They couldn't do that with the Tokugawa isolationist policy. Now, was it presented this way in the middle of the 19th century when the United States is trying to get into Japan? Of course not. General popular discourse doesn't talk about the cold mechanics of international trade and politics. All right, you get sort of things like this here. This is a painting entitled Commodore Perry Carrying the Gospel of God to the Heathen. Yeah, that's a nice way to contextualize this entry into Japan that is much more digestible to the general populace in any case. The premier concern had nothing to do with religion or heathens or anything. It had to do with material concerns, in this case a coaling station. Now, the arrival of the United States put the Japanese into a quandary. What do? You can't ignore this major power with an impressive fleet who's asking to establish a coaling station. The Japanese would not want to replicate mistakes made by other portions of the world with respect to ignoring the realities of European power. And what this caused was a schism in amongst the Tokugawa governance, especially after the United States in 1854, after these long and tiresome talks to get Japan to open up, threatened to do bombardment. In fact, gave a demonstration of their military power. And ultimately, the Japanese would agree to open up and allow a couple of trading ports, I believe at Shimoda and Hakodate. Let's not worry about the specific names. But this caused a schism in Japanese society because you would have the traditionalists, the nationalists who said, hey, look, this is a change. We don't like to see this radical change. We've lived 2.5 centuries with a distinctive perception of outsiders as problematic and detrimental to the Japanese way of life. If you would, a contaminant of sorts. That's worked for us. We would like to continue with that policy. So you have the nationalists who want to keep Japanese isolation, and you would have the internationalists who said, well, no, we need to open up to the outside world. We can't ignore it. These innovations cannot simply be swept under the rug. They exist. There'll be a price to pay if we do ignore them. Moreover, they're appealing innovations. Those are the internationalists, and this struggle was substantial in Japan. The result would be that the internationalists would beat the nationalists. In other words, the Tokugawa governance would fall, and what would come in is the Meiji governance, often referred to as the Meiji Restoration, because this was all done under the notion of reestablishing the emperor on the throne. Let's not worry about those internal fineries. Suffice to say that the Tokugawa governance essentially ends in 1867, 1868. All right, and the Meijis come into power. The Meijis were essentially political interests who wanted to see Japan open up to the world. Now, just as the Tokugawas were radically isolationists, the Meijis flip all the way to the overside. No moderation here. They're ultra internationalists. They embarked the country on a vigorous westernization campaign, trying to entirely remake Japanese society in a short few years. This was a major undertaking, bringing extremely problematic changes in Japan. In fact, you can see one expression of the Meiji governance coming into power. The Kyoto was the traditional capital of Japan, located in the central portion of the main island of Honshu, indicative of Tokugawan isolationism. Well, when the Meijis come into power, they move the capital, this is another example of a forward capital, to a peripheral location over here at Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, which means Eastern Capital. All right, that's indicative of a Japan that's opening up to the world, since it's at this major trading port and commercial hub. The Meijis come into power, and things that were thought offensive to foreigners were banned or discouraged. Everything foreign all of a sudden was something to be pursued. It had status. And I mean everything from public bathing to tattooing, pornography. The eating of beef became a sign of progressiveness. Japan switches to the solar calendar. Sunday is adopted as a day of rest. Christmas becomes a holiday. There was even a movement to make English the national language. It was just a movement. In fact, Meiji, the name Meiji, essentially translates to enlightenment. So this was the period of enlightenment, ultra-westernization. In fact, if you go to Japan today, you'll have to make a trip to Kyoto. The reason why is because, of course, Japan is a modern industrial country. It looks like a lot of modern industrial cities. They have a similar appearance, global, around the world. All right, but if you go to Kyoto, Kyoto has been kept, at least the core of Kyoto, as the pre-modern, pre-industrial Japan, ancient Japan before the great conversion to modernity. And so you'll go visit Kyoto if you go to Japan just specifically to see what Japan looked at before the industrial era, with all of its problematics and impressive technological accomplishments. This rapid cultural change was dizzying after the Meijis came into power. In fact, especially for the elite class of samurai. All right, the samurai were a warrior class. They represented somewhere between 5 to 8% of the population. They range in status, obviously, from being well-landed lords to very humble samurai in any case. And this is a picture from 1890 of 3 samurai in yoroi, which is the traditional, the full set of Japanese armor. And what they were doing is they wanted to have their pictures taken, because it was clear that the era that had arrived, there would be no place for them. All right, their past identities were being extinguished by what many called progress. There was no need for samurai if you want to have a modern military, which is based on commoners using industrial weapons, not samurai using weapons which require a substantial amount of skill. There's not a lot of samurai. You need a modern army if you're the Meijis, and that means commoners using industrial weapons. So essentially the samurai lost their privileges. And of course, they would be deprived of any possibilities to make a living and maintain themselves in this Japan, just because they're people with status who have essentially you can't easily lower your social status and do so with a lot of dignity. People tend to find that problematic. Even the wearing of swords, the traditional wearing of swords in public, was forbidden in 1876. And the Japanese hairstyle, the traditional Japanese hairstyle, the top knot, came to be seen as a stigma. It was primitive according to the international, culturally internationally oriented Meiji period. And the result in Japan would be a series of uprisings by those who were not accepting the vigorous cultural change that was being foisted upon them. These uprisings were largely the vanishing samurai class, arguing for against this radical change. In fact, you might have seen the movie The Last Samurai. It's an interesting movie. It portrays just this period where the traditional samurai are fighting for their traditional identity and a traditional way of life against a modern, shall we say, mass military, again, using what are seen as proletarian instruments of war, which had no honor in any case. Do see this movie. It's a rather interesting movie if you can decenter the star, that being Tom Cruise here. Please do. The background is rather interesting. Of course, at the end, the samurai will be eclipsed. You know, modernity will not be stopped. And that's what you saw in this movie, The Last Samurai, which is really, some people think is referring to Mr. Cruise. It wasn't. It was referring to another figure, a fellow by the name of Saigo Takamori, but another matter. Let's not worry about that. I had to put this poster in there because they, since they're going to show our hero here fighting in this war with strangely no headgear, he was on the losing side. And what he should have done if you were on the losing side and you were captured, the traditional act would have been to do ritual seppuku, all right, which was taking your blade and shoving it in your gut. This did not occur at the same time when it's being shoved in your gut. You have somebody lop your head off. This did not occur for the sake of to put a bit of cultural finality on this. I'll do what the film didn't do and hack off that head. Anyway, that's what should have happened. Hollywood would not allow that. In any case. All right.